My name is Claire and I'm 34 years old. When I was 9 years old, I stood in the hallway of our house on Maple Street and listened to my mother tell my father that I asked for too much. I had asked for a winter coat because my old one had a broken zipper and the wind came right through it every time I walked to the bus stop. My mother looked at me standing there in the doorway, cold air still clinging to my sleeves, and she said, "You'll learn to make do. Everyone does." I remember the exact sound of the radiator ticking in the hallway that night. I remember the smell of onions frying in the kitchen, and the flicker of the porch light outside the window, and the way my socks felt damp from walking through slush earlier that day. I remember thinking, even at 9 years old, that I would spend my whole life being told to make do with less than I needed. That coat never came. I wore my brother's old one instead, sleeves rolled twice at the wrist, and I told my friends at school it was vintage, because admitting the truth felt worse than the cold. For 15 years after that, I tried to make myself small. I apologized for taking up space at the dinner table. I said it's fine when things were not fine. I got good grades because good grades didn't ask anything of anyone, they were mine, quiet and self-contained, proof that I could be worth something without needing to be given anything. I learned that love, in my family, came with conditions, and the condition was always the same: don't ask for more than what you're given, and don't ever expect anyone to give first. Then, at 26, I met Daniel. Daniel was 36, a high school science teacher, the kind of man who remembered which mug I liked and always turned it so the handle faced me before I even sat down. On our third date, over cheap noodles at a place with a flickering neon sign, he asked me what I wanted, not what I'd settle for, but what I actually wanted out of life, and I didn't have an answer, because no one had ever asked me that question before. I remember staring at the steam rising off my bowl for a long moment before I could even speak. 6 months later, standing in his kitchen while rain tapped against the window and a pot of tea went cold on the counter, he handed me a spare key and said, "This isn't a test. You don't have to earn it." I cried for 10 minutes, right there on his kitchen floor, and he just sat down next to me and waited, patient as the rain outside, until I was ready to breathe normally again. We got married when I was 27, in a small backyard ceremony with 40 guests and string lights strung between 2 oak trees. And that's when my mother-in-law, Vivian, decided I was a problem to be managed. Vivian never liked me from the start. She thought Daniel could have done better, whatever that meant, better meaning, I eventually understood, someone with more money, more polish, someone who came from a family Vivian could brag about at church. But the real trouble began 3 years into our marriage, when Daniel's father passed away suddenly of a heart attack and left Vivian alone in a house too big and too quiet for one person. Daniel, being Daniel, invited her to move in with us just for a while, and a while turned into 22 months of Vivian rearranging my kitchen cabinets, commenting on my cooking, and telling anyone who would listen that I was difficult. The cruelty wasn't loud. It was quiet and constant, like water wearing down stone, drop by drop, until you stop noticing the sound and just feel the ache. She'd say things like, "In my day, wives knew how to keep a husband happy," while looking directly at me over the rim of her teacup. She'd tell Daniel's sister, in front of me, in the same casual tone she used to discuss the weather, "Claire's just going through a phase. She'll settle down eventually." She never yelled. She didn't have to. Every sentence was a small cut, precise and deliberate, and after 22 months, I had a lot of small cuts, the kind that don't bleed but never quite close either. There were nights I sat in the bathroom with the fan running just so I could cry without being heard through the thin walls. There were mornings I rehearsed conversations in my head before I even got out of bed, bracing myself for whatever comment might be waiting for me at the breakfast table. Daniel tried to intervene more than once, and every time he did, Vivian would tear up and say she was just trying to help, and somehow, by the end of the conversation, I was the one who felt like I owed her an apology. The breaking point came 14 days before Daniel's sister's wedding. At a family dinner Vivian had insisted on hosting in our own dining room, using our own good dishes, the ones I'd bought with my first bonus check at 30 years old. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone right after. 7:40 p.m. Candles were burning low on the table, wax pooling in small amber circles, and the smell of roasted chicken still hung in the air from dinner. Vivian set down her wine glass, looked around the table at Daniel's sister Meredith, his Aunt Rosalind, and his cousin Priya, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Claire will never leave Daniel. She has nowhere else to go. This house, this life, it's all because of this family. Without us, she has nothing." The table went quiet. I heard the refrigerator hum from the next room, the small mechanical sound suddenly enormous in the silence. Daniel started to speak, his jaw already tightening, but I put my hand on his arm. I understood, in that moment, exactly what Vivian was afraid of. She wasn't afraid I'd leave. She was afraid of losing her place at the center of things, the house, the family gatherings, the sense that everything ran through her since her husband died. Control was the only comfort she had left, and she was gripping it with both hands, even if it meant tearing someone else down to keep it. I almost felt sorry for her, in that strange way you can feel sorry for someone even while they're hurting you. What Vivian didn't know was that 4 months earlier, Daniel and I had quietly refinanced the house into a trust, my name first, his name second, after his father's estate had created some complicated tax questions Vivian herself had triggered by insisting on being added to old paperwork for simplicity the year before. Our lawyer, a calm, unhurried man named Mr. Okafor, had walked us through it carefully over 2 separate appointments. The house wasn't the family's. It hadn't been for 4 months. It was legally, entirely, ours, with my name listed first on every document, the ink barely a season old. I hadn't told anyone. Not because I was planning some big reveal, but because Daniel and I agreed that some things don't need to be announced. They just need to be true. I kept the folder in the bottom drawer of my dresser, under a stack of old sweaters, and some nights I'd think about it there, quietly, like a small stone I could hold on to when the days got hard. There was one more complication that week. Meredith pulled me aside in the kitchen 2 days before the dinner, drying a dish with a checkered towel, and said, "I know Mom's hard on you, but please don't make a scene at my wedding week. Just let it go, for me." I understood her fear. She wanted peace before her big day, and I didn't blame her for wanting that, but it stung, because it meant even the people who saw the cruelty expected me to absorb it quietly, the way I'd been absorbing things since I was 9 years old. I told her I would never do anything to hurt her wedding, and I meant it. But I also knew I couldn't keep swallowing 22 months of small cuts forever without something eventually breaking. So when Vivian said those words at the table, "She has nothing," I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even stand up right away. I let the words settle over the table like dust, and I waited until the room went still, until the only sound left was the clink of Priya setting down her fork against her plate. Then I said, calmly, "This house has been mine for 4 months. Vivian blinked, the candlelight flickering against her face. "What are you talking about?" I reached into the bag I'd brought to the table on purpose that night, and set the folder down. Not thrown. Not slammed. Just placed, gently, the way you'd set down something that was never really in question. The deed. My name is first. Daniel's is second. Yours isn't on it at all. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and heavy, like the moment right before a storm breaks. Rosalind looked down at her plate. Priya's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Meredith's eyes went wide, and I saw something shift in her face, not anger at me, but a kind of recognition, like she was finally seeing the shape of what I'd been carrying alone for almost 2 years. Vivian's mouth opened and closed, once, twice. She reached for the folder, then pulled her hand back, like it was hot to the touch. This can't be right. This is a mistake." I kept my voice even, steady, the way I'd practiced in my head 100 times without ever meaning to use it. "It's not a mistake. It has been mine for 4 months." She looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend her, to say there was some misunderstanding, some paperwork error that could be fixed. He didn't. He just reached over and put his hand over mine on the table, and that small, quiet gesture said more than any argument could have. Vivian sat back in her chair, the wood creaking under her. For the first time in 22 months, she had nothing to say. Not a comeback, not a correction, just the sound of her own breathing and the clock on the wall ticking past 7:52. Rosalind was the one who finally spoke, her voice soft. "Vivian," she said, "maybe it's time to let the kids have their home. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this to humiliate her. I didn't do it for revenge, even though some small, tired part of me might have wanted that after 22 months. I did it because I was 34 years old, sitting at my own table, with my own good dishes, and I was done being told, in my own dining room, that I had nothing." 2 days later, I sat down with Vivian alone, in the quiet of the kitchen, before Meredith's wedding, because I didn't want old wounds to overshadow a day that belonged to someone else. I told her she could stay in the house through the end of the month while she found a new place, and that Daniel and I would help her look, no strings attached. It wasn't generosity for show. It was the kind of boundary my mother never taught me, firm, but fair, given without needing to be earned first. Vivian didn't thank me. She just nodded, quiet, smaller somehow than she'd been in 22 months, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Meredith's wedding came and went, warm and unremarkable in the best way, string lights strung between the same 2 oak trees from ours, a slightly off-key toast from Daniel that made everyone laugh, Vivian sitting quietly at a side table instead of the head one. Nobody made it a scene. It didn't need to be one. I danced with Daniel under the lights, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was bracing for the next small cut. 3 weeks later, Vivian moved into a small apartment near her sister's place, boxes stacked neatly by the door. Daniel helped her carry them down 2 flights of stairs on a Saturday morning. I made her a casserole for her first night there, because petty isn't the same as at peace, and I wanted, finally, to be at peace. A few months after that, our house finally felt like ours. Not because of the deed, that had always been true, quietly, in a drawer under my sweaters, but because the small cuts had stopped. I started leaving my shoes by the door without apologizing for the clutter. I rearranged the kitchen cabinets exactly the way I liked them, spices on the left, mugs on the right, the handle always turned toward whoever reached for it. Daniel and I started Sunday mornings the way we'd always wanted to, coffee on the back porch, birds in the maple tree, no commentary from anyone about how I made it. Here's what I've learned. You can spend years being told you have nothing, that you'll never leave, that you should make do with less, and still, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, build a life that belongs entirely to you. Strength doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like a folder placed calmly on a table, and 5 words spoken without raising your voice. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay perfectly still and simply tell the truth. If you've ever sat in a room where someone tried to convince you that you had no ground to stand on, I want you to hear this: you might already be standing on more solid ground than they know. You don't owe anyone a scene. You don't owe anyone your anger. You just owe yourself the truth, spoken plainly, when the moment finally comes. Breaking a cycle doesn't happen in one dramatic moment, even if it looks that way from the outside. It happens in the years before it, in every small choice to ask for a little more than making do, in every quiet decision to protect yourself before you're forced to. The folder on the table wasn't the beginning of my story. It was just the moment the rest of the world finally caught up to what had already been true for a long time. If this story reminded you of your own room, your own table, your own quiet reckoning, I'd love for you to stick around. I share stories like this every week, because every story here is for someone who needed to hear it tonight.